Back live with you tonight here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. Complaints have come in thick and fast amid controversial efforts to kick out pregnant learners ahead of the year's matric examinations beginning this week already, with key case studies clouded by superstition in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, this comes as several parents and stakeholders lament lack of response from the province's education authorities, as nearly 1 million learners are poised to write final exams. Joining us now to further react to this story, we have the SA Human Rights Commissioner, Gaum, as well as SADTU head of the secretariat, Xolani Fakude. Gentlemen, good evening. Good to have you with us, and thank you very much for your time. Well, let's start with you here in the studio. Is SADTU aware of the discrimination against pregnant learners by teachers, and why this may have arisen, and the reasons why it's continuing?
Firstly, let me greet you, let me greet Commissioner and as well. The question is SADTU aware? This is a system in which is our lived experience on a daily basis. So it's not only just about teenage pregnancy, by the way. There are many other socio-economic, rather you would call those, factors that we see in our schools. And yes, we do have got that particular challenge. I mean, when you look at about some of the statistics, they're actually quite shocking. I was reading some of the reports this morning. You know, in the first quarter, for instance, let's not even speak about this one. The first quarter of 2021, you had about 36,000 young people falling pregnant between the ages of 10 and 19. Yeah. Now, that tells you that we've got a particular problem. Now, we are also aware as a union, and this is part of where we're trying to also intervene by also rallying stakeholders. We are aware that we've got a dropout rate issue in South Africa, and we need to start speaking about it more regularly, not as an acute problem, but as a chronic problem rather. For instance, from those who would have entered grade 1 to up to matric, we are reporting right now that it's just a few weeks, in fact, before the matric exams. From those who enter to those who actually leave the system across, it tells you that we do have got a particular challenge. Now, what we've always been saying as SADTU is that there are rights that learners do have, yeah, even the ones who are pregnant, by the way. Yeah. South Africa is a signatory to a number of conventions that we have actually affirmed as a country so that they can strengthen our policy. Yeah. Now, the question then is that how then do we do that practically? It is therefore our position and our view as a union that this is where really a multiple stakeholder collaboration effort comes in. Okay. It is also about the parents. It is also about the education department. It is about NGOs. It is about the SADTU, for instance, that all of us must just hold hands together.
So you're correct in saying that because the policy itself, when it is released, it envisages that. It says this has got to be a multi-stakeholder situation where, yes, the teachers, the educators have got an obligation to reasonably accommodate pregnant learners, but parents have got an obligation to come and report on the medical status. They've got an obligation to support communities generally. Absolutely. So do you think we passed the policy without engaging meaningfully with the communities and all the other stakeholders that are supposed to play a part, and hence we are continuing to see this lack of compliance with the policy?
You're actually raising a very fair point. You would actually remember that just a few years ago there was an issue around the sexual education policy, for instance. And we had a particular backlash when the Department of Basic Education actually pronounced that this is part of the direction which we must be taking as a projection of our education system. But what did you see? You had other stakeholders actually pushing back and saying, but then you cannot be teaching our children about intimacy. And then we are one of those stakeholders who came on and said that no, it is not about that. It is actually about making sure that our learners, our youth, are also aware of the implications of some of these behaviors. And of course, we're dealing with complicated issues. In your introduction, you even referred to superstition, for instance, as to why a pregnant learner cannot be in school. And we are saying as a union that let us engage and let those pregnant learners, they equally have a right to be in school and to a basic education system.
Yeah. Commissioner, what you said, do we have laws? Yes, we do have laws that protect. We've got the Constitution that is clearly articulating what the rights are of learners, even pregnant learners. Now we have a policy that speaks about what can and cannot be done. The learner cannot be barred from coming to school just because they are pregnant. Learner has a right to privacy. Learner must be given sexual reproductive education. Learner must be given choices. There must be reasonable accommodation. All those things are articulated there. But it seems that is just not enough. Because if you look at the number of reports of learners that are continuing to be suspended and being sent home, it tells you that, yes, we have a policy in place, but it's not enough. What else do we need to do?
Yes, we obviously have the policy in place referred to my colleague from SADTU, the policy on the prevention and management of learner pregnancy in schools. But I think a positive new development is also the protocol on the elimination of discrimination in and through schools that have been released after being approved by the Council of Education Ministers this year. And in that, it states very clearly in respect of pregnancy that the law is clear, as it says. Learners who become or have been pregnant have an equal right to be free from discrimination and to receive and complete a quality education. As we also know, and it states that as well, learner pregnancy is a leading cause of girls dropping out of school. So the law is clear and the policies are clear. I think it's all about implementation now, and therefore the Commission has been involved with the Department of Basic Education to develop the new textbooks that we understand will be compulsory in schools for purposes of life orientation, that is human rights sensitive also in this respect of pregnancy as such. But also we are working with the Department of Basic Education to have a model human rights compliant code of conduct, as well as a broad diversity and sensitivity intervention program in schools that will involve parents, it would involve learners, it would involve the student representative council members, teachers and the like. And so we believe it's a matter of implementation, it's a matter of education and promotion of human rights that we really need to speed up our efforts in that regard to really make sure that policies and legislation are not only on the law books, but that they are actually implemented.
Yeah. Commissioner, one would say you're correct that education, promotion probably would be key, but the other question would be how are you going to monitor that it's being implemented? Because I think monitoring would also need to come with the implementation and then consequence management.
Yes, no, absolutely. Monitoring, also specifically one of our mandates as a South African Human Rights Commission, is very critical and important. But in that respect, it's also important that parents and learners who come across unfair discrimination on the basis of pregnancy bring that to the attention of the Commission so that we can address those matters and provide a necessary redress for those affected.
Yeah, so reporting would also play a fundamental key role here on the part of the teachers and on the part of the parents as well. Is there enough education? I mean, are teachers, for example, being educated enough around how to handle a learner who's pregnant? Because sometimes these are some of the fears that probably come in as we speak of superstition and other things that could be misconceptions. But are teachers being taken through a process of, okay, we've got the management policy and the no discrimination policy, but this is what you do with a pregnant learner with health complications?
Well, again, you're asking a very, very fair question. And our view in this case would be that more can be done. More can be done and more should be done. Yes, we do have got some kind of exposure as education workers, as we call ourselves, in terms of some of those gender sensitivity issues, for instance, including pregnant learners. However, the reality is that teachers in the South African context are extremely overwhelmed. The responsibilities that we have on our own as responsibilities in front of a classroom are just too huge. And that is why, Thabo, by the way, we are one of those stakeholders in the sector that have always spoken very strongly about the lack of psychosocial support services within the system inherently. When we went into our Congress in 2019 as SADTU, for instance, we went through an extensive research process. And part of those startling observations that we made was that in the Department of Basic Education itself, there is so few psychosocial support personnel across the levels when you consider the system the size that it is. We are talking about 13.1 million learners. We are talking about just below 500,000 education workers, or educators, in fact, and even more education workers within that particular system. So our issue has always been that what kind of support then do we offer these education workers? You see, all education matters, cannot be relegated only to the teacher and the learner in the classroom. More needs to be done, and more can be done. And that is why also we are calling also for better collaboration between the departments that are supposed to implement some of these issues. So you've got the lead department, in the Department of Basic Education. You then have got other departments that have got other capacities like social development, for instance. Now we are saying, where are those psychosocial support personnel that we need? I mean,
are you saying you were thrusted into a policy here? Because the policy says you need to give care support and counseling. You're talking care support and counseling for the educators, but you need to give care support and counseling for the pregnant learner.
Absolutely. Then that tells you, though, Thabo, that a lot still needs to be improved within the context of the value chain. In fact, our teachers themselves do need support on their own, by the way. And of course, then we are expected to play that particular parental role in terms of our learners. But that is why then we emphasize, Thabo, that it is all about collaboration. We are also saying that the parental involvement in our education system is absolutely critical. Most of the most successful education systems in the world, they've got one common characteristic. It is increased parental involvement, so that we can be able to really have a collaborative push around some of these issues. But what is important now is that the rights of pregnant learners, the rights of the girl child actually must be protected. It is sacrosanct.
Commissioner, it seems that the job is even more here in terms of the various schools that have adopted the policy in the country that now need to put those counseling services in place, where in some instances, as we're hearing from SADTU, those kind of services are not in place. What role does the South African Human Rights play there? Oh, dear me. We seem to have lost the commissioner there. All right, we'll try and get him back on. That line giving us a challenge. So you've got counseling services that are required. What happens when learners need medical attention?
That is once again what is also guided by the policies that are already existing in the context of our education system. The problem, when we speak about medical attention, for instance, it is one of those elements that you really must look broader. That is why we are saying that we need a very firm and cohesive national policy that not only deals with medical emergencies. Yes, there is the immediate protocol that we know should be observed by education workers, by the SMTs.
Are all schools able to do that?
No, that is the
you look for a simple thing as a medical aid, first aid kits. Whether all schools, public schools, have got that in case of an emergency.
Well, in fact, ourselves as a union that represents education workers, we endeavor to make sure that also part of our monitoring mechanisms that we have in place can even assist us to pick some of those issues up. The fact, Thabo, is that not necessarily all schools do have the necessary and the required material to deal with some of the emergency issues. And part of the reason, let us also nip it where it is supposed to be. Part of those challenges, Thabo, are related to the austerity measures, which I see, as we say as a union, being brought into the system through the back door. So in fact, no matter what we can be told about the education budget, by the fact of the matter that we are experiencing in some cases, that is why you've got so many newly qualified education workers, nurses, police, who cannot even be absorbed by a system that requires a more efficient public service system. So what we're saying is that more can be done, but then we now also need to have a national conversation about how we see the funding of education. Because it is not just about a mid-term a budget that will be presented by a minister who will also remind us about how you've got such challenges about the head count, etc., etc. But then we also know as a society that we actually need more of those public services right now. And that is also directly linked to the kind of tools that are there and availed in our schools to implement some of these good policies that we have. Because let's be honest, the policies are very good, they are very good, but the question is, are they implementable?
Indeed, we'll come back and get a reaction from the Commissioner as well on that. Is there something that we can do in that instance where we keep on piling policies, but of course policies have also got to come with an implementation plan which is supported by resources? What happens when we don't bring the resources but the plan is in place? We'll get your views as well tonight. 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us at Newzroom405. In Focus continues shortly. Back tonight on In Focus, the question, of course, of pregnant learners and their ability to be able to write exam. Why have we failed to create an enabling and supportive environment in our schooling system? The South African Human Rights Commissioner, Gaum, still with us, and SADTU's head of the secretariat, Xolani Fakude, with us here in the studio. Commissioner, I was saying, is there a way, legally in law, where we could force government to say, well, you have created the policy, you then come up with the implementation plan, but fund it, get the resources. It's no use to say pregnant learners must get care support and counseling if there will be no counselor who is paid, who is there to be able to do so.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with that. Obviously, you can't say there should be a package of care support and counseling and that then, expect schools to do that themselves. There need to be support from government side. And to the extent of that is not provided, one can even argue that the right to basic education is not properly realized, and it's an immediately realizable right. So sometimes people think the right to a basic education is only about access to basic education. It is not. It is about quality education. It is about these very important matters as well. But that is one specific issue that needs to obviously get attention and needs to get funding, because it doesn't help you have a plan of action and timelines to implement that, but then you don't allocate budget for that purpose. But on the other hand, there is a very important matter of unfair discrimination against these learners that seem to persist and continue in some schools. That is outlawed. Our courts have decided on that matter. Our laws are clear. Our policies are clear. And in that respect, teachers need to, implement the policy and the legislation and so on. The National Department of Basic Education has a program also now being run at universities as part of the curriculum called Care and Support for Teaching and Learning. But it is not a compulsory program for teaching students to follow, and it should become a compulsory program. And we should make sure that everyone in the school community, not only teachers, but also parents, as well as the management of schools, and all of those know and understand how to deal with diversity and sensitivity, and are quite clear on not to unfairly discriminate to people on the basis of the prohibited grounds, and one of those, of course, is pregnancy.
Yeah. Commissioner, here's a sticking point, and one that I don't know if the South African Human Rights Commission has given it thought in how we navigate it. Some groupings have raised the issue of gender equality, right? In the sense they are saying, right, you've got a policy that will accommodate the female learner, relatively so. There will be instances of absence. There will be instances where she's going to go away. Yet, some of these pregnancies happen consensually between the female learner and the male learner, while the male learner is allowed to continue with the schooling as normal. How do we navigate that aspect of equal access?
Yes, now, that doesn't seem to be an argument that will hold any constitutional sway, in the sense that this is specifically unfair discrimination that takes place on a prohibited ground, or it's discrimination on a prohibited ground that is presumed to be unfair. and it would be very difficult to show the contrary, because there are also rights that are coming into play, including the right to a basic education that is immediately realizable and so on. So it is a bit unclear to me how that argument is balancing rights in a manner that would then come to the conclusion that it is not unfair discrimination for some other reason to accommodate pregnant learners and to make sure that their rights are protected.
All right, let's talk about this then. From the teacher's point of view, how do you ensure that teachers continue to give support? And by support, I'm saying, learners are saying it's either a teacher would not give me access to notes, or a teacher would not give me additional homework because maybe I'm absent that day or I was in labor, or even when I return, the recovery afterwards, I'm not supported.
Well, it's a whole systemic issue. Let us look at the entire value chain the way it is. So what we are saying now is that unfortunately, our chances are likely to be limited in terms of how we can thoroughly navigate around these issues when we only limit them and only make some of this as a responsibility of only the teacher. We are saying that, I like your question. The question is, how then do we make sure that teachers support those learners? And we would say as a union that let us also support the teachers themselves, by the way, given in particular the responsibility that they have. I mean, Thabo, in our country, we've got a system whereby many schools, by the way, are still not having the required learner-teacher class ratio, for instance. We've got our members who tell us that, but I teach a mini-mass meeting. It's not even a classroom, by the way. Now, when I then have now to go even, we don't mind going the extra mile, by the way, but then when there's extra responsibilities, because also we've got a very odd system, a system that also requires a lot on the teachers to spend a lot of time also on morning classes, afternoon classes. That is now over and above what is required legally and according to our employment contracts, the same as weekend classes, the same as holiday classes, etc. So you can imagine the amount of responsibility that is lying on the shoulders of teachers in this case. So what we are saying is that, I mean, for instance, as a union, we've got a campaign that we're passionate about. I mean, a school fan campaign, which is really about how we mobilize all sectors of society. When we speak about the high dropout rate, it is also a responsibility of community members to ensure that when you know that there is a child next door who has stopped going to school because maybe there might be a lack of information about their rights, they might be feeling discriminated against by the school, how then as a community member do I take responsibility? We know, Thabo, in our country we believe it takes a village to raise a child. Yeah. So now those are some of those ethical questions, the values that we want to see coming to the picture. I also like what the commissioner was raising around the curriculum, what then becomes compulsory. And some of those becomes how we address the issue of raising a whole and complete individual who can then contribute meaningfully to our country. And we're saying that the girl child has to be protected. It's sacrosanct. Yeah.
Commissioner, you wanted to weigh in on that. Are we being too simplistic here to just expect the teacher to go the extra mile? Yes, they will go the extra mile, but there are certain complications or even demands that we're putting on them that are going far beyond their scope and maybe in a sense also inhibiting their rights as opposed to have a normal life in a sense.
Yes, now I have a lot of sympathy for that. I've been MEC for Education in the Western Cape. I've been Deputy Minister of Education. I do understand the extra pressure being put on teachers. But from a legal and a human rights perspective, it is so that, there needs to be reasonable accommodation of these learners. And I mean, that is a principle that is very much part of our equality law. It appears specifically in our Equality Act and so on. There needs to be reasonable accommodation. And that would, of course, entail extra efforts and so on. And once again, I'm also supporting the notion that teachers need to be supported in providing that extra support, in providing that reasonable accommodation. I take that point absolutely. But from a legal perspective, specifically a human rights perspective, that reasonable accommodation need to be provided, because otherwise you're essentially, to a lesser or wider extent, you are denying that learner the right to a basic education. And that is, in the first instance, that we are guarding against.
Commissioner Andre Gaum, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. Fakude, much appreciated as always. And thank you very much for coming on. That is, of course, where we wrap the conversation for tonight.